To conclude, Chapter 13, Southeast Asia, the economic and geopolitical factors of this region of the world. Southeast Asia is a huge agricultural region, and it's linked to the global economy through that, and in recent years through industry that is relocated there, mainly from the Japanese. It has over 500 million people. It's sparsely settled except for the delta and coastal areas and zones of fertile volcanic soil, because other areas of Southeast Asia have infertile soil over much of the archipelago because there's so much rainfall that it tends to wash the nutrients out of the soil. And Java is an exception to that rule because there's 50 volcanoes that provide nutrients for rich soils. And there's 124 million people in an area the size of the state of Iowa. And most people live on the coast. And again, that's why they promote that transmigration, trying to lower that population density. And this is the coffee belt. This latitude all the way around the earth, ladies and gentlemen, has excellent soil there, and that's where most of the world's coffee is grown, the coffee belt at this latitude, where Java is an example of. And there are high population densities in the agricultural valleys and the delta regions, such as the Chao Phraya in Thailand, the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, and the Red River Delta and Mekong River Deltas in Vietnam and Laos. They are densely settled areas. And this lake area in Cambodia also has a large population. It feeds the Mekong River in the dry season, and it receives overflow during the rain. And we've talked about Sweden already and how this is used, and again, it works well as long as there is not a high population density, because then there's problems with air quality. We've talked about opium and methamphetamine production. The Europeans introduced commercial plantation agriculture, mainly in rubber and rice. The world's biggest supply of natural rubber comes from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. And sugarcane and pineapples are grown in the Philippines. And in the early 2000s, Vietnam, interestingly enough, emerged as the second largest coffee producer, and large harvests at that time resulted in a drop in prices again. Growing commodities is a double-edged sword, ladies and gentlemen. Just because you have a large supply of something doesn't mean you're going to get the price that you seek. And rice grows very well here. It was that high yield variety that actually helped China's population to grow at different times in history, and it had its roots in this region of the world. And agricultural chemicals are problematic for causing environmental damage. These things have, again, that's part of the whole green revolution that we saw in South Asia. They've also introduced some of those man-made varieties in this part of the world as well. Indonesia has had uneven development, a boom-bust cycle. That's what happens in normal capitalist economies, ladies and gentlemen. Burma or Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and East Timor have never experienced the boom cycle. The Sultan of Brunei is heavy in the oil industry. He's a friend of the United States. Singapore today is heavily into high tech, and they are some of the world's most prosperous areas. After World War II, this was the most developed country in Southeast Asia. Its GNP was higher than South Korea's, and it declined mainly because of the Marcos dictatorship, because of the crony capitalism that was practiced by Ferdinand Marcos. They squandered billions of dollars, and the problems continued through the 1990s. And they have attempted to improve the infrastructure in the 21st century. The former U.S. naval base at Subic is a new economic engine for export processing. And Cebu City is expanding as well. And since 2004, there has been some high growth rates, but there is still revenue and spending problems like the U.S. economy, and also the historic unequal distribution of wealth as well. Singapore was the regional hub. It's the greatest success story in this region. It went from being, as I mentioned, an entrepot port city into a thriving high-tech manufacturing center. It welcomes direct foreign investment, that neoliberal philosophy. It invested heavily in education, housing, and social services, but this is an extremely authoritarian region. And the internet today presents authorities with their greatest challenge. How do you control the internet? It's almost impossible to do, ladies and gentlemen. Original development in Malaysia was focused on agricultural and natural resource extraction. We've seen that in other regions. And manufacturing in recent years has enabled Malaysia to break into the middle income status among Southeast Asian countries. And Western high-tech companies operate there in production of many high-tech devices. And this is where a lot of this stuff is made in the world. Wealth is largely in the Chinese-Malaysian community. Ethnic Malays are less prosperous, and tribal peoples are poorer still. There has been some attempt to redistribute wealth, and there's also the problem of brain drain in Malaysia. Thailand's economy has had many ups and downs, and it's been a large downturn happened in the late 1990s, just as it did in Japan, and there was a military coup in 2006, which slowed the economy as well. Export growth remains strong because of the Japanese factories that have relocated there. It's mainly in Bangkok, and Chao Phraya is a prosperous area because of its agricultural resources. Chiang Mai benefits from tourism, and the Lao-speaking Korat Plateau is the region's poorest region. Men work in construction and women work in prostitution. Indonesian development, it was one of the poorest countries on earth at independence. The Dutch were extracting natural resources and they grew export crops. There was expansion in oil production in the 70s, and the multinationals expanded into Indonesia because of low wages. Its growth has not matched that of Thailand, Singapore, or Malaysia. The financial crisis of the late 1990s severely impacted the region, and the banking industry was hampered by that. Geographical disparities with wealth distribution, as in these other regions, and in Sumatra, because of their oil production, that's a pretty prosperous region. The overcrowded rural districts in central and eastern Java engage in subsistence farming, and the tribal areas are even poorer as well. And it's never really experienced any development. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, they have followed the Chinese model since the mid-1990s. And since 2007, this has been one of the most prosperous, extremely high growth rate areas of the world. But the tribal Vietnamese have not participated in this. The Laotian government is engaged in infrastructure development. They have a huge hydroelectric program going on. And they're hoping that Thailand then will actually buy some of the electricity from them. Cambodians resent economic integration, though, with Thailand, and there's been rioting in Phnom Penh over this particular economic idea. Foreign investment, tourism, oil, and natural gas fields are spurring growth today in Cambodia. And Aung San Suu Kyi, she was president a while back. She helped to end the military dictatorship there. And here is the current president of Myanmar. He was just elected in 2016, Tin Kya. And he is a highly educated Burmese. educated overseas. Burma has had problems. This is a land of great potential because of its natural resources. They've been at war for 50 plus years, and it's only been very recently that it has been at peace. They tried to open up the economy to market forces, and then the banking crisis created a real severe downturn that resulted in the military taking over. And again, as that picture pointed out in the Saipan Tribune, former President Obama visited there. And it's had rapid but uneven integration into the global economy. Singapore is heavily involved in the global economy. And with the rise of China, Southeast Asia has achieved more balance, and it's not as dependent today on the U.S. market. And consumers are aware of the exploitative labor practices in Southeast Asia, and they put pressure on the multinationals to try to improve working conditions. The geopolitical factors: the Portuguese were the first to arrive in the Maluku Islands, or the Spice Islands, in 1500. That's what the Europeans were originally interested in, which is key as a preservative in the days before refrigeration. The Spaniards conquered the Philippines in the late 1500s. The Dutch East Indies were a huge colony of Holland and the Netherlands. The French, Stamford Raffles, established Singapore in 1819, and they allowed local sultans to continue to have limited power. And Great Britain focused mostly on the Malay Peninsula and northern Borneo until 1963, when it became independent. And Singapore became an independent nation state, as we mentioned in the other video, and Brunei remains an independent sultanate today, and they have all kinds of oil in that country. Thailand avoided colonization. They were successful in playing off the British in Burma and the French in Indochina. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos was Indochina, and they played those two colonial powers off and maintained independence. After the U.S. defeated Spain in 1898 and took control of the Philippines, there was guerrilla warfare for years with Filipino nationalists like Emilio Aguinaldo. And after 1920, there was growing nationalism. The Japanese occupied the Philippines until the end of World War II, and the Philippines became independent in 46, and Burma 48, Indonesia 49. And the naval bases will remain in the Philippines until the mid-1990s. The Vietnam War, this was a civil war to try to get France out of the region, and then the U.S. slowly became involved after the Viet Minh defeated the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. At that time, the country was divided into the North and the South, which was basically just an anti-communist dictatorship. And eventually, the U.S. took the side of South Vietnam. And that was a huge mistake. We supported France originally, our historic and World War II ally. And why did we go in there? Because of the domino theory. If Vietnam falls, then eventually it was believed all the others would fall as well. And that actually nearly happened, except Thailand and Burma did not fall to the communist bloc. After 1965, there are U.S. combat troops there. Even though we had an overwhelming superiority in arms and materiel, we never gained control on the ground. You can't bomb half a bridge, ladies and gentlemen. We never knew who we were fighting, because this was a civil war. And in 75, the communists took control of Vietnam. Hundreds fled south after reunification, and the Khmer Rouge was the Cambodian communist group, and they took over the country. They attempted to re-educate people in concentration camps. The wealthy and the educated were executed. And they tried emulating the French Revolution they're starting all over at year zero. And it's estimated that they killed in the killing fields 1.5 million people before Vietnam invaded. And there's warfare then for the next 11 years. The peace was negotiated by the United Nations. And here, the Hmong Americans would like to see a new government in Laos. The Hmong people were supporters of the U.S. during the Vietnam conflict. And here are some geopolitical tensions today in Southeast Asia. The striped areas were the original Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The solid yellow were additions, and the rifles indicate areas with armed insurgencies today. All of those areas would like to become their own independent nations. That area of Southwest Philippines especially. There were conflicts in Indonesia because the Dutch for a while refused to relinquish their colonies. And eventually, Jemaah Islam Maya would like to see a single Islamic state across Mindanao, Indonesia, Malaysia, and southern Thailand. And there's been United Nations interventions in this particular part of the world, trying to end these different ethnic and attempts to form their own nation states, mainly in Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the very bottom of China. There's great interest in one last thing. In the South China Sea today, the Spratly Islands here, because they have discovered oil here. Once again, another huge source of oil, and that's not even come online yet, ladies and gentlemen. It's all there. Who's going to control it? Philippines, Vietnam, or mainland China? That's a big issue in this part of the world today. And that ends Southeast Asia.